All right. Good morning. As you can see on the agenda, I'm supposed to summarize what happened yesterday. This is one of those occasions where the summary is longer than the actual thing, and you still had to be there to understand what I'm saying. So goodness knows what I'm going to say. But, we put on your seatbelts. Let me try to do that. I think the first thing that has to be said is that this has been a process, if you like, not an event. We heard a bit about that, yesterday when we talked about the sort of the iterative run-up towards defining this as how we're going to work and starting connecting us together. But how much this has been a process, how much this has been a community-building event, can be measured by, a very important variable that I assess at all conferences, which is how hard it is to get people to come and sit down at the start of a session. And you probably noticed yesterday that it was almost impossible. I was having to do all kinds of antics and sort of pulling you around and yelling 10 times before we could get you out of all the different informal groups. Very good sign. Very good sign of the kind of community building underneath process that's happening here. This is a dangerously potent group of people who have been deeply involved both in this tool and in trying to transform the food sector for very, very many years in very many different ways. And many of you said to me that you met people that you've been hearing about forever but had never been able to have these kind of conversations with. This, I think, is a very important part of what happened yesterday, quite apart from the formal presentation of all of these different things. What are we wanting? What do we want? What are we hoping will come out of this? This has been very nebulous. I've been trying to sort of ask people in an informal way while lining up for things. And you all say very different things, except that you all want more. You want more. You want more numbers, more work, more application of those numbers. There's a huge feeling that more is going to work. And now as well, that's the other point, except just a minute, I'm just finishing a conversation. But nevertheless, I want it now. So I think there's a kind of potency also in that. And that, of course, is going to be our big question today. What is this more? And particularly, what is this strategic more that we want that's going to enable us to use these tools, this process, to go further? Yesterday, I saw a huge desire for numbers. Rarely do you see such a desire for numbers, a salivation for numbers, the dizzying excitement when there's 1 trillion, not just 1 billion attached to any number. We're digging into all of this. Every time we see another, massive, gobsmacking distortion to the systems that we're in, there's a kind of, it's creating a kind of an intrigued buzz to it. One might expect a group like us to be depressed every time we discover some other thing which is desperately wrong, that we are spending, 19 times the value of certain products in the destruction of natural capital to produce them. This could create depression in another group. But here it mostly creates an excitement of opportunity, that if we can only convey this, we might be able finally to deal with some substantial changes in public perception and policy. Despite all of this apparent falling into place, I think yesterday also revealed to us the size of the beast that we're dealing with. In how many different dimensions do we have these kinds of distortions? And one, I think, important thing about this process is that it's tended to get together in ways that have rarely happened. The people, for example, who are coming out of the kind of natural capital valuation and who are making a fairly, I think, with the help of this process, a fairly easy bridge between the kind of environmental accounting and food system, but it's connecting us with the people who are thinking about public health and so on. Rarely have we been in these discussions. Now, yesterday, in Kentucky, those of you who are there will remember that we did everything in plenary. So whatever your interest, you're wildly enthusiastic about soil carbon, but you're sitting there listening to, a whole series of presentations on public health or other things. There was a great benefit in that, I think, Today we had a different approach. We went into greater depth, which I think we needed to in these different areas. But fortunately, we had to do that by allocating into streams. Now, it was wonderful to see how many people went to streams that were nothing to do with their expertise. But nevertheless, you know, of course, we tended to go to the things we knew most. And I was wondering, actually, whether we should have done a trick, which is to tell people, health is going to be discussed in here. And then when you're in there, lock the door and say, no, soil. But we need to somehow, we need to maintain that spirit where at the same time as we obviously each of these areas has a lot of its own detail and specificity, but at the same time we're clearly realizing that if we're going to use this as a overarching narrative, we ourselves have to know that narrative. We ourselves have to bridge out. Next point. I think if we didn't know it already, we discovered yesterday that we have a power tool. We have a power tool here. This set of mechanisms for looking at true cost. And everybody likes a power tool, I think. Maybe that's not quite true. But it is exciting to have this new tool to hand. Here were some of the things that I thought excited us about it. It seems to be a method that can make visualizable, comprehensible, huge amount of complex detail in something that's quite striking. Quite presentable. Not only do we have these fabulous single numbers, you know, that supposedly, you know, give us a sense of the level of distortion, but also we have these mapping techniques where we can see how that distortion now plays out across spatial or other variables. Very powerful tools to visualize and present to others. We have a story-making tool. I thought that we demonstrated a lot yesterday how we could take those numbers and convert them into new types of narrative which can engage people in change. Some of the obvious ones, you know, are around the health narrative. How on earth we are going to, you know, to rationally allocate public energy to deal with, you know, our new public health framework. You know, it's no longer, you know, communicable diseases or whatever. Now it's the sagging century, which we, sagging and slow poison century that we're going to go into. We've now got a tool that we can help people to see, wow, this is how we could tackle those problems in a financially viable way. Also, we have a new narrative for dealing with the bridge between conservation and agriculture. This can be a very important part of that. As you know, as somebody said in one of the sessions, you know, this can even make soil degradation sexy. You know, so we have a tool, a very powerful tool, a tool maybe that can help us to provide, you know, almost a killer blow to this system, which, as we said yesterday, is very resilient to critique because its distortions create so many financial incentives for everybody who's in the system to try to maintain it distorted in the ways that it is. So this is part of this ways that we can pull the threads on this skein and unravel it in some kind of fashion. But of course, you know, every power tool has its discontents, and I was quite struck yesterday that we were not shy in critiquing as well, or identifying the weaknesses and dangers of this. That data alone do not change the public mind. We're going to have to become ever better at relating data to societal processes. It's going to require us to think very clearly about everything from interest groups to how narratives are constructed. I think that there was a healthy tension in the room yesterday between those people who think that there's a significant possibility of rational change made by governments and multilateral institutions, and those people who think that this tool will primarily help societal change, civil society, business, new entrepreneurs to change, and that we shouldn't expect there to be any, you know, we shouldn't expect leadership, from the people with the responsibility to do that. So there's a tension, an interesting tension there, and I think it'll continue to be played out. Then, of course, we had You know, the critiques about commodification, that certain important things cannot be put into the kind of models that we're doing. We had, of course, as well, the critiques within the models. There's the details of these models matter a very great deal, and if we're not careful, we can find ourselves, we can discover that our tool is nothing like, especially if it's proprietary or very specialized. In fact, what happens is that the tools get rubbished, or details of the tools get rubbished, and this diverts us from the narratives that we're trying to create. And then, of course, we had all of the discussion about the capacity of markets to deliver justice, and so on and so forth. You know, we can know the value, the cost of everything and the value of nothing, and so on. So I thought there was a very exciting, important, useful early critique of these methods at the same time as we enthusiastically develop them. So that really, I suppose, is my vague attempt to summarize yesterday. Of course, all of that is to say that today is our crucial day. Today is the day in which we try to move towards what can be done, what are our strategies, what are the probably a set of ways, undoubtedly it's not going to be a single way, but a set of ways that we can cohere around some significant pushes forward, deploying this tool to, you know, to mobilize significant change. And on that note, I hand back to Patrick.
You're going to sit here, I hope. Thank you, Ken, for setting the scene. More than, I think, 2 or 3 people said to me yesterday that given the amount of energy and effort that has been put into coming here and being here for 3 days, it is absolutely essential that we leave these 3 days with a forward action plan. And the whole of this morning's session, until we leave for Clarence House, is dedicated to making some progress on that. If this was going to be easy, it would have already been done by now, so it's clearly not going to be easy. Christy came up to me last night and said, you talked about evolution, not revolution, but what we actually need is revolution. So without backtracking on what I said yesterday morning, I think we need revolution through evolutionary stages. And, and we're moving out of a reductionist phase where the food systems have been dominated by very narrow thinking, and I think almost by definition the solution has to be systemic. It has to be an integrated thinking, and as Ken has just said, we need to bring a number of strands together and think about action plans on each of those. So that's how we've tried to organize this morning. And the way we're going to do it is as follows. We've got an hour and a quarter now, just around 10 minutes, to deal with the first 2 of our themes on reaching consensus for future action. I've asked Ken to stay up here because I think we need all of us to be engaged in this process of reaching that consensus on each of the 4 themes, and I need help to do that, to make sure that I don't miss something or miss one of you wanting to make a point or miss a conclusion that we need to draw and capture. So Ken's going to support this process. The first of the themes is food systems and externalities, what additional research is needed. Then we're going to move on to policy mechanisms, the range and scope of mechanisms for internalizing externalities. Then we're going to have a coffee break. And then we're going to reconvene, and we're looking at strategies for public engagement. And then finally, engaging the business and farming communities. And for each of those themes, I'm going to invite 2 or sometimes 3 discussants to set the conversation going with some introductions. Now, mindful of the fact that we need as much time to talk as possible, I'm going to beg you all to keep to time. And the mechanism I'm going to have to encourage you to keep to time is I'm going to sit in that chair, you're going to come up, and maybe some of you are going to show some slides. And then when the time is nigh, I'm going to stand up and I'm going to walk towards you in a very friendly way, just to remind you that you need to stop. Because I think that this has to be an exchange between all of us, because we haven't yet got the ideas. And as Guillermo and others have said, we have to have an action plan. and we have to have reached most of the key actions that we need to take forward by the end of this morning. So, without further ado, we're now going into food systems and externalities, what additional research is needed, and Ian Bateman is going to kick things off. So Ian, come and start the discussion.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to keep to time, so I'll get straight on with this. So just a review of a whole host of things, plus I admit some of the stuff that I think is particularly useful. I hope you can hear me all right. I'll try and stand here. So to understand the research needs, we've got to first of all think, well, we must understand what affects the land, what changes land use. And that means we've got to look at a whole range of drivers of land use. You need to understand the natural environment and its diversity across space, and also how it changes across time, climate change being an example. We must consider the market. That has a colossal impact upon land use, and technology, difficult to assess the future, but very important, and of course policy. All of those things have to be considered. If you just focus on one, you won't get an adequate picture. Doing this allows you to see what the drivers of the land actually are. Then we need to think about the what I'd call the impacts of that land array. And don't forget the most obvious ones, the food and income. I'm quite surprised a lot of conservation research seems to forget that actually these are vital elements of land use and values generated. Thank you very much. So don't forget that. But of course, we're interested in all the other consequences as well. And it's certainly true that if you leave things just to the market, you're going to ignore things like the impacts on the water environment, other land use like woodland, recreation, biodiversity, and the variety of greenhouse gases associated with land use. So all of these really set up quite an important research agenda, I feel. The relationships between these are complex, and sometimes they even have feedbacks. The nature, the functions involved can be non-linear, and any sort of oversimplification could result in very erroneous results coming out of it. I do think that there is the opportunity to express these impacts in economic values now. There's been great strides. There's been some dreadful valuation work in the past, but I do think that there are methods and opportunities now to really improve on that and actually value most of the impacts, including externalities of land use. And if you do that, then you come to the conclusion that the best use of land actually is probably not the use that we've got at the moment. And bringing these other things into the decision-making process does radically change the use of land that you have. And I want to illustrate that with something that is literally hot off the press. So you've probably heard about the NEA, the National Ecosystem Assessment. Well, there is an NEA too, and that finished well, it was supposed to finish last week. It actually finished at about midnight on Sunday in my office. And this is what came out. It was motivated by a particular change in land use. The English, Scottish and Welsh governments all want to plant a lot of forestry. We're looking in total at anything up to about 750,000 hectares. So obviously they all want some in their own countries. What will happen if we make decisions in the old-fashioned way and we just completely leave it to the market? We will find those forests banished to the most marginal of lands. It'll basically go to the places where the farm margins are the lowest. And you'll get forests in remote upland areas, often of very high biodiversity value, areas that, for example, have peat soils, where actually you will generate global warming forests, which will emit more greenhouse gases than they store. So basically a massive failure if you just leave things to the way decisions are usually made. If you just bring in one of those externalities, greenhouse gases, you immediately move the forests off all of those peatlands, off those very remote areas, and you move them towards areas where they're not going to be emitting greenhouse gases. Indeed, they may be beginning to displace a lot of the methane, for example, that you get from excessively high stocking areas. What if instead of considering greenhouse gases, you consider recreation? Woodland generates a lot of recreation. Forests move again, and they move towards where people live, and you end up with rings of woodland around Britain's populated areas. And what if you do what you're supposed to do and consider all of these values? You end up with this sort of intermediate move. You notice there's still no planting up on those upland peats. You've still got rings of forestry around where people live, up in the Glasgow, Edinburgh area there. Okay, but you're not emitting the greenhouse gases. And this gives you a much, much higher value. In fact, when you assess these options using the HM Treasury own rules, you find that the first solution actually gives you a big net loss. So taxpayers pay for something which actually generates a loss. If instead at the same cost you bring these in and you actually move these forests to different areas and you actually generate very substantial benefits for the UK population. Last thing that I think we need to focus on in research is engaging the business sector. I'm going to assume that public sector is pretty pro the idea of doing things that are good for society, but they do not have the resources to really make the massive impacts that the private sector can do. Last slide. Just help your legs. We could go for regulation. I really wouldn't advocate it. It's not just in America that regulation is a dirty word. It's also not very efficient. You could go for public sector to private sector incentives. Good idea. Even better idea is trying to open up the possibility of private to private sector. And an example we want to give is some work that we did with Lawrence on the Foyth River. So there you've got a situation where this catchment generates most of the water for Cornwall, but it's got quite a lot of pesticide and other pollution in it. Very expensive to get that pollution out. A change in regulation allowed the water company to intervene and stop the pollution getting in. Much cheaper. So the water company saves money, and through a little bit of economics, you can actually efficiently get the farmers on board without them saying that they need £1 million a year per farm compensation. Okay, so I think that's a set of research priorities that would make an agenda for the future.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ian. We'll come back to you because I want you to have a further think about how you would frame future research needs in a really tight way in which we can take it forward, because that's, don't forget, the theme of this discussion. But Stuart, would you like to come up and give our second intervention?
Thanks, Patrick. Stuart Platt from DEFRA. I haven't got any slides, and I promise to keep to time. You marching towards me scares me to death, so I promise to do my bit. I wanted just to highlight two areas where we're looking to develop the evidence base, the sort of more data, more information, albeit not necessarily now in terms of when we're able to sort of deliver on that. I wanted to highlight two areas. First one, the development of ecosystem accounts, where DEFRA is working with the Office for National Statistics, having published a roadmap in December 2012, setting out how we intend to develop these wider set of ecosystem accounts by 2020. Woodland, enclosed farmland and wetlands were identified as priority areas where we needed to make progress, building on and bringing in the valuations, recognising the point Ian made about the way in which we're continuing to improve our ability to value these externalities and these effects and the delivery of these ecosystem services. The enclosed farmland, woodland and wetlands are broad habitats as identified in the National Ecosystem Assessment, so clearly looking to link in with that. The ONS has already published sets of data and papers in relation to woodlands, and work has started on wetlands and enclosed farmlands. So the farmland set of accounts, the enclosed farmland set of ecosystem accounts is currently work in progress. Clearly, it's not an easy process, despite what Ian was saying about the way in which progress and techniques have developed and improved. There are complications around how we recall the interactions between the different ecosystems, how we, as it were, attribute services to particular ecosystems, understanding, recognising obviously the links between them. There are issues around how we can sort of record biodiversity and ecosystem condition within the accounts. This is not just about having information on the length of a hedge, it's the quality of that hedge and the value of service that then derives from that, and the difficulties around those sorts of aspects. And then there's issues around the actual valuation process itself. Trying to work out, determine how much of a value of a particular product is attributed back to a particular ecosystem. And clearly the whole tricky area where when we're looking at non-marketed goods and trying to estimate the value of those services, cultural service, regulation services and so on, where there isn't a market, albeit techniques that we can look to adopt to estimate those values. And where the spatial dimension, as illustrated by Ian in relation to the forestry example, complicates things considerably in terms of how we can assess those values. The development of the enclosed farmland accounts builds on earlier efforts, earlier work to develop environmental accounts for agriculture, which date back over a number of years. I'm not quite sure where they would all fit on Ian's definition of what the quality of what's been done before. I'm sure they're towards the higher end of that spectrum, but nonetheless it represents continued development in those areas. And DEFRA's now led a contract to develop more spatially disaggregated woodland accounts, very much linking in with the ability then to assess the way in which the value of services delivered can vary in that spatial dimension. The Natural Capital Committee was closely involved in the development of the roadmap, and we see that as a key user. I was briefly going to mention the other area where we're looking to develop a research platform looking at sustainable agriculture, and the idea behind this is a substantial commitment, over £4.5 million commitment over 3 years, but the issue here is looking at trying to better understand the interaction between different ecosystem services and how they operate at different spatial levels, at the farm level, at the landscape level. And so there's a substantial research project that we're just commissioning there to improve our evidence base, our understanding in that context, to see how we can develop a more optimum mix, as it were, of the balance of ecosystem services delivered through agriculture, agricultural land. And also to find ways in which we can help mitigate the sort of trade-off that we inevitably have to make between the different ecosystem services.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and we'll bring you in again. We really appreciate the interest that DEFRA are taking in this theme, and to have Ian here, who's led so much of the natural capital work, is important. But I'm going to throw out a question which I hope will stimulate discussion, which is that I'm listening very carefully to the language that both of you have shared with us. We're talking here about food systems externalities, and there are lots of terms like natural capital. And I've had a conversation with Ian in which he's assured me that natural capital absolutely includes food systems. But I feel there's a marked reluctance to really go into the food systems themselves rather than talk about some of these sort of ecological and capital issues. And I think that what's needed now, and I'm going to hide behind the Prince of Wales here in throwing out this challenge. He said to me, and I referred this to you, this conversation to you in the email that I sent all of you before this event. He said, I can't help thinking that if we're going to get a major shift in public understanding about these issues. There needs to be some kind of an authoritative report on food systems externalities, which identifies the gaps in our knowledge and pulls it all together and presents it in a comprehensive way with the kind of level of authority that the Stern report had, which enables the seismic shift which is needed to get this attention into the attention of the public and the media alike. So I want to put it to you all now, because this needs to be an exchange, and we've got about 20 minutes. Do you agree with that analysis? What are the gaps in the research? What new research is needed? And never mind just doing the research. How can we pull that research together and present it in such a way that it achieves this shift, which I think, and I suspect you all think, is needed? So I'm going to now throw the discussion open. Could you keep your interventions short for obvious reasons and come straight to the point? Because we've got by the end of this 20 minutes to have a proposal for how we're going to take all this forward. Guillermo.
Thank you, Patrick. I think that's a good proposal, and we'll how to move forward. I have a question for Professor Bateman.
Please.
My name is Guillermo Castilleja. I'm the head of the Environment Program at the Moore Foundation. One of the things that strikes me about your research and the modeling that you have been able to develop for the UK is just the amount of data that this requires. I would like for you to give us a sense about how data rich is the UK compared to other countries and how scalable this might be.
Thank you very much. That's actually a very good question. The UK is probably the most data-rich country in the world, more than the US per hectare by a long way. So, for example, the agricultural model that underpins this work brings together 47 years of data. Each period is assessed at a maximum 2 kilometre scale. Each 2 kilometre has about 200 to 300 records. And if you just do the maths on all that, you need to know that, I've forgotten how many million hectares there are, 24 million hectares in Britain. Do the maths on that. And that's just one of the modules in there. It's a colossal amount of data. We are very conscious of the issue that you're flagging up here. Can this only be done for the UK? We have tried on 2 occasions to get funding to undertake a study where we take our methodology and we apply it to a data poorer environment. We've tried to do it in the US, tried to do it in the EU. Haven't got funded either times. We also tried to do it in Southern Africa. So unfortunately, I can't give you a definitive answer. Other than it seems pretty obvious to me that what would happen is that you would increase the amount of uncertainty around the estimates. And the question then is, do you increase it to the extent that you're no longer improving decisions? Now, I personally think that decisions in most parts of the world are so poor that actually you'd still be improving decisions quite substantially.
Thank you. Guillermo, do you want to come back? No. Okay. Right. Could you, from now on, could you stand up to make your point? The next person is Hardy Votman.
Hardy Vogtman, German League for Nature and Environment. We are discussing the question, if we want the change, we need to take civil society with us. Our question is, do we need not already to involve civil society in the agenda setting of research? So we are discussing, if we want a sustainable society, don't we need a more democratic approach in research? Trying out and decide which is the agenda and how do we get the funding going? Because I just give you briefly an example. In Germany, we found out, nobody knew, there is a research union advising our chancellor on the 8 billion spent every year on research. And this research union is exclusively set by representatives from large companies in Germany. So our tax money is spent on research which is decided by the large companies. And I think we need a different approach in research, involve society, involve civil society in the agenda setting and in the funding of the research. And then we get more, then we get your funding you need for your research. Exactly.
Thank you. That's a very important point. Scott is next. Could he have the microphone?
One of the things that was has been striking to me the last day and a half is we've seen a number of displays of either examples of accounting or maps, and but as Stuart remarked, in order for true cost to be powerful, there needs to be a strong database, strong modeling base behind it. To me, an important challenge is building in economic dynamics. And here what I mean is, think about accounting normally. Where do prices come from? Well, they come from markets and they change. And so we need to be working from models that allow relative scarcity to change, including in the areas that are not marketed. So to me, that's a major challenge ahead.
Thank you. Tim, I think, was next.
Good morning, Tim Crosby, Thread Fund out of Seattle, Washington. I work with a lot of businesses and financing, and so on the research side and trying to understand the private sector aspects and what are they measuring. I think that's a big piece, as was mentioned. Specifically, what are the profit margins of sustainable agriculture products? From the work I do, I know that the profit margins on commodity products are generally lower than sustainable agriculture. Part of it is volume, part of it is niche markets. But if you can make money at this, selling this food and producing this food, we should try to figure out how to help that out. Hard numbers to get to, the profit margins of specific products, but if we can start that bridge, we can really move forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Pete?
Pete Myers, Environmental Health Sciences. I was struck by the fact that there was not a word about human health in the two presentations. And I know we have a big research agenda ahead of us in that field. I also know that it is human health that's going to allow us to connect most effectively with that public at large that you just referred to. We need those data. And I'm happy to report that under the leadership of Dr. Leo Tresand at NYU University and Jerry Heindel at the National Institute of Environmental Sciences, there is an effort underway, a serious effort, to begin to assess the health externalities of endocrine disrupting compounds, including those in industrial agriculture. And could I ask Leo to say just a little bit about that?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Leo Tresandi, New York University. While there are some uncertainties around the relationships between those environmental chemicals and human health outcomes, there is at least enough of a body of evidence, a quite substantial body of evidence that one could at least attribute a portion of major chronic diseases that affect children and adults all across the developed and developing worlds. And one could quantify that quickly from a disease burden to a tangible economic cost that ultimately is borne by health ministries here in the UK, across Europe. It's more diffuse of an issue in the United States because we have private and public payers, but those are substantial values add that would be achieved through prevention of those toxic chemical exposures, and I'm happy to reflect offline more. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm hearing from both of you that you think that there's a major need for research to gather the data and presumably more research to get data in this field as part of this study.
And one of my goals is to make sure that that effort is coordinated with this effort, because they're feeding toward the same thing.
Right, okay. Nadia from FAO.
Thank you, Patrick. Nadia Shalaba from FAO. We've been the last 2 years trying to develop a global model for true cost accounting in FAO for food waste. And we have all the crop-specific data, country data, land degradation, scarcity, income at the producer level, and market prices. So we've been modeling that on a global basis. My comment is really related to Ian graphic on different valuation methods, where I had a glance at it. You know, there is a lot of double counting between the different valuations on different ecosystem services and so forth. And I think if we really want to do something which has any application in real life, we have to be able, and this is a lot of work to be done still, to translate such graph, if you want, into boxes of actions that do relate to different constituencies. For example, what are the type of issues that are important for agriculture, environment, health, rural development, labor, whatever, in order to enable those constituencies to take action within their jurisdiction. As long as we continue having this very academic wishful thinking type of thing, I'm sorry for that, but you know, we are confronted with this in FAO all the time, we will not go anywhere. And we had an experience in the 90s on integrated coastal area management, on externalities. It's a no man's land in a way when you talk about externalities per se, unless you're able to divide them in a way that each constituency could add some actions in their policy and planning so they can act upon change and address those externalities.
Nadia, what do you think the potential for collaboration with FAO on some sort of, study is? Do you think there's some potential there?
Well, myself in the work I'm doing, I mean, I'm very willing to cooperate, yes.
And do you think the FAO would support that?
I cannot talk for the whole of FAO, actually. I can talk for myself.
Okay. Abby from RSPB.
Thank you. Yes, Abby Bunker from the RSPB. I wanted to pick up, perhaps unexpectedly for some, on the health issue. We've just been doing some really fascinating work with the University of Essex, who've developed an indicator of connectedness to nature for children, which has shown some actually, and tested it against a baseline, and showed some really worrying statistics about how unconnected children are to nature. But this kind of combines with what I feel, my understanding is an emerging evidence base about how there are health and well-being impacts and values, mental and physical, of a thriving and healthy environment, and the access of people to that environment in their locality and in their lives. And a question really to others here, do we know enough about, is there enough research and evidence on that value of people's access and connectedness to a thriving nature, and kind of trying to incorporate that with the physical health issues in relation to farming systems? It would be nice to kind of integrate that into a kind of a health and well-being whole.
Thank you. I don't know if anybody wants to, does anybody want to respond to that specifically? Oh, okay. We'll move on. 1, 2, 3. Okay.
Hi, I'm Lee Marinoff from New York AgriLiving. I wanted to echo something that Abby said. I really think that if we want to make the seismic shift that we're all talking about, we do need to include both children, education, and a small farmer. I don't feel there's been enough talk. There's been some talk, but not enough talk about the small farmer. And Harvey yesterday mentioned looking at small farms as a collective and seeing if that could help us in a sustainable way going forward, but also looking at the new way of farming, which involves more perennials and less annuals, getting away from the soy and the wheat and going towards a more perennial base, which solves so many problems at once.
Thank you. Can Ellen be next? And then Wendy, and
Thanks.
then Tim, and then Lindsay.
Ellen Gustafson, Food Tank, but I'm also a for-profit entrepreneur, which is relevant because I think something we should try to move away from is the fear of maybe the word regulation, but the very least the fear of regulation itself. And I just caution that because sometimes regulation does work and sometimes people actually do accept it. No one would have thought that the smoking ban or the seatbelt wearing or so many of these things that actually do work from a regulatory perspective do change behaviors and can actually have really great health outcomes. So I think we've been backed into a corner, especially in the last 30 years, by business, and that the language around the fear of regulation, that business is somehow going to come, riot in the street. I just think we need to be very cautious about shying away from that, when sometimes that can actually create an operating environment in which business can do quite well, but people can obviously do quite well also.
Ken, you want to comment on that briefly?
Just quickly on that. One of the things that I was struck on in one of the panel presentations was various examples in the UK from Michael from RSPB, who was pointing out that markets were effective at solving certain problems only because they were in well-regulated contexts. Where you had either bad regulation or regulating the wrong things, markets produce perverse responses. So I think that really speaks to what you're saying.
Thank you, thank you. Now Wendy, then Tim, then Lindsay. By the way, we're coming towards the end now, so we're going to have to sort of like do some crunching of all this in a minute.
Wendy Silver, UC Berkeley. I just wanted to add on to something that Ian said with regard to climate change and data needs. And while I think that we do need to look more into mitigation and the potential for agriculture to contribute in that direction, we also need to think about adaptation and severe events. And we're seeing more and more severe events. We know very little about what the impact of those are on agricultural systems, and also what the economic costs of those are going to be. And I think we need to really begin quickly to pay attention to that and fill in those gaps.
Thank you. Now Tim.
Hello, I'm Tim Lang. I wasn't here yesterday, but thank you for the summary. I want to pick back on the issue of consumer engagement, because this can't happen top-down, nor can it happen imploded or pushed, although that's the most likely. Most of us think shock is what's going to change things, so what we're actually talking about is how to prevent shock. So if we take the engagement theme that others have said, I would say there are three things where we need data. I'm an academic, we always want contracts, but I assure you I'm not interested in doing this. This is what I think is needed to change things. The first is we've had 100 years of culture around cheapening food prices for consumers. It's been very effective. It's the model that's now engaging in the developing world. What would it take for that to change? We need to have that sort of research. Secondly, we need to find out where the money goes. Who gets the money if you have an expensive, internalized, re-internalized food cost system? Where does that money go? Can we get more money to primary growers? And thirdly, the really big one, I think, that integrates this is, what does land use look like if it's designed around ecological public health? We don't know enough of that. What does it look like if we eat 9 portions of fruit and vegetables a day, if we have low fat, if we eat grass-fed, not grain-fed meat? What does land use look like? Because that will be expensive food, and that's where the block is going to be.
Thank you, Tim. Lindsay, I'm going to have to close it down and make some summaries in a minute. And if you're really getting frustrated because you want to make an intervention, you could always come into the next session. But we have to get this closed quite soon now. Please, Lindsay.
Okay, Lindsay Stringer, University of Leeds. I just want to highlight a subtle distinction between the calls for more data and the calls for more research. There's a lot of numbers, there's a lot of data that are already out there, and I just want to flag up the importance of looking at our existing data and perhaps reframing the questions that we're asking from that data, because that can actually be a more cost-effective way of getting to some of the answers that we need and to getting towards the new knowledge. And just to pick up on one of Ian's points about modelling as well, I think it's really important, and again it relates to data. We can model forward looking to the future, but actually there's a lot that's happened in the past and there's a lot that we can learn from the past. And again, I think we need to not be afraid to look backwards and use that to then help us move forwards.
Thank you. That's a perfect sort of introduction to what I want to say, which is that you can shout at me if I've got this wrong, but what I'm hearing confirms my feeling that there is a need for some sort of integrated initiative which brings to, because everybody has spoken on the need for more information in different spheres, but everybody also, I suspect, agrees that this has to be an integrated approach. And Hardy's point was echoed by someone else, can't remember who, Tim, I think, that we need somehow the public, we need to democratize the process of organizing this, I think is a crucial thing. Now, how can we take that forward? I mean, for me, that is the question, because it's the Prince's question. He's going to ask us this, don't forget, at lunchtime. He's going to say, what's going to happen now to enable this discussion to break through into a public discussion in a way which will serve the need that we all think exists. So I'm going to ask Guillermo again, because I've had a conversation with you about this. What do you think? I know Ken wants to say something as well, but just have you got a thought about whether a study is needed, how we could touch on all these different aspects, the health aspects being highlighted, how we can bring it together? Do you agree with the need for some sort of integrated study? And of course, Lindsay's point about the difference between data and research, that's critical too.
I do think that there is a need for an integrated study. I think that we have to have some kind of a assessment that has credibility, that can actually show us that it is possible to sustain 9 million people with food that is farmed and produced in a sustainable way. I think that's an important issue that needs to be corroborated, and I think that a study would do that. I also think, however, that we also need more of an insight on what is going to be the theory of change that we think is critical to take us to that outcome. Because we're talking about data, we're talking about modeling, but that is not telling us how change will happen. And I know that the second part of the session this morning is going to be more about the policy and the way forward, but I think we need to get into that. I think that we should get out of the trap that by getting the study right, voila, there's going to be a change in minds and things will happen. I think that we still need to articulate our own way of describing how change will happen, and that should be part of that study.
Right, well, we've now reached the end of this session. Would it be right, we obviously haven't reached, how many people would agree that there is a need for an assessment, taking into account Guillermo's very last point, that the theory of change is an integrated plan which involves all the 4 elements of what we're discussing this morning, but one element of that might be an assessment which brings together, which supports the theory of change that you're saying we have to come up with by the end of this morning. And would there be an appetite for that amongst the people here to participate in it in some way? In which case, what do we do to keep the momentum of that? That's the question. So first of all, is there broad support for what Guillermo has just said? Is there anybody who feels violently that this is not the right approach to take? Well, what can we do to maintain this initiative? How can we do this? Shall we report back to you with a proposal? Because we've got to have some momentum on this. Pete, very briefly.
We've been talking about a range of different types of externalities. We can create subgroups of people who are willing to take on those areas within their expertise, and then coordinate the development of those estimates across those subgroups. I think it's pretty clear what has to happen.
Okay, here, very briefly, please, yes. You'll have a mic.
Ann Thrupp from the Berkeley Food Institute in University of California, Berkeley. I just wanted to add on to that and say that one element of an integrated study of this sort, to me, would be really excellent to highlight success stories and to learn from those success stories. Because I think we all realize that there is a lot of progress being made by certain farmers, certain institutions, organizations that are not only accounting for externalities, making changes in the problems that are occurring worldwide, but also progressive businesses, nonprofit organizations that are really working towards implementing sustainable agriculture widely, and to learn how those successes came about. I know some of the work we've done at Berkeley and in my previous work has highlighted those things, and that from that we can really learn what methods, what methodologies both of research and of application are affecting change. So, I mean, we can build, and it's similar to the point that was made earlier this morning, we can build on what's historically has worked, but learn more effectively of what enables that to scale up and to really, you know, be more widely accepted and adopted.
Okay, well, look, come back to me afterwards, and apologies for the people who I didn't let in. I'm taking from this that there is broad agreement on the need for some kind of integrated assessment, maybe with subgroups. We will report back to you with a proposal, trying to draw all these strands together. I'm going to go to Ken now before, and then we will hand over. And Ken, you finish this conversation.
As we think about this, I think that we will want to take. I mean, it seemed to me that all the fabulous stuff we had from the floor a moment ago were making two broad kinds of points. The first point was how we need to make our modeling and data management process better, stronger. You know, models that are less, you know, are less linear, can deal with extreme events, et cetera, et cetera. So I think we want to bring that in. And secondly, the second half of the point seemed to me about models of civic society or societal engagement. And I think we very much, I think, will want to have that process in, both in terms of setting an agenda, but also this relates again to the theory of change, how the products of that modeling are going to engage the people who are actually going to push for intelligent change. So I just wanted to sort of register that all of those comments, I think, will be very, very relevant to that process.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'm sorry, it's going to have to be like 10 seconds.
What time frame are we talking about? I'm sure you're not thinking 4 years, but what time frame for research?
Do you mean for the assessment, or? Well, I think it'll be a process in time, and if we're going to set up a working group or subgroups to make a proposal, we're just going to get on with it. I mean, I can't comment on that. There's a sense of urgency about this discussion. Everybody thinks we should move with some speed to go forward with this. I'll say that for now. But please hold this, because it does relate to the theory of change, integrated approach that we should have towards this, and it reminds me, actually, this is perfect, because Alexander said to me yesterday that with energy in Germany, they had a change plan, an energy change plan, and Alexander was at the heart of that. So we're now going to move on to policy mechanisms, range and scope of mechanisms for internalizing externalities, and I'll invite the three discussants to speak very briefly, even more briefly if you can than the last two, because we've got three of you, and I will stand up again, and there are two of you who've got a couple of slides. Make it one if you can. And I think I want to introduce this simply by saying this, that it's been said during the discussion that policy and regulatory mechanisms are not mutually exclusive from some of the other components of the theory of change. So we don't have to have an argument about which works. We need both, actually. So, Alexander, would you like to come up and start things off?
Good morning to all of you, and thank you, Patrick, for giving me 3 minutes or 5 to present policy options to change $1 trillion business. That's quite a challenge, and I would like to start with 3 headlines. The first headline is sharing knowledge and generation of new knowledge in a different way. I will come back to it. The second headline is understanding the magnitude and the complexity of the challenge. And the third headline is, with a big question mark at the end, do we need a new form of governance for the transformation of this system? So let me start with knowledge. What we have learned yesterday in many of the sessions and also in the discussions in the evening was that all these externalities we are talking about could be seen as a very good description of the Anthropocene. Mankind is a geological force. If you look at the rate of extinction of biodiversity, it's mankind. If you look at the CO2 emissions and all its impact, It's our business model. It's our lifestyle. If we look at deforestation, if we look at the health impact, we have a huge impact, but this, you will not find all these impacts in the current model of gross domestic product. The GDP does not really cover it. So if we take this full cost accounting seriously, we have to find a way to change the GDP. It doesn't cover everything, and this is quite a challenge. And therefore, we have to bring together the best knowledge, and we have to generate new knowledge on the impact of mankind on our planet and how to include it in the GDP. The concept of GDP was developed only after World War II. It doesn't exist for so long, and it had a very specific purpose: to rebuild industry, to rebuild the economy. And therefore, we are in a very different situation than 60 or 70 years ago, and we need a new concept, and GDP is the most powerful figure in the world. All the governments in all of the countries are looking at, do we have a growth rate of 1% or 2% of GDP? And this means yes to their politics or no, and therefore we have to change it. This means taking your question, true cost accounting, seriously, bringing the best knowledge from all different areas of expertise, including civil society and private sector together, to have a new, very powerful figure to explain where we are going to. Second headline, the magnitude of the challenge. Let's not underestimate that we are trying to repair an airplane while it is flying in 10,000 meters. Population growth plus 3 billion in the next 80, 90 years. All population growth will happen in developing countries and in urban areas. This will change the system completely. Africa is the new gold mine for supermarkets. If we want to change this system, we have to ensure that we are not going down with production, but we are, instead of it, improving livelihoods of people, which means we have to also tackle the inequalities. The current system is full of inequalities. In the United States, we have about 10% of the people being hungry. That's more than 40 million. And we have 30% of the people being obese. That's a crazy situation. In India, very high growth rates in GDP. 4,000 children are starving every day, full of inequalities. So we have to tackle, while repairing the airplane, all the inequalities of the passengers. This also means that we have to have a development perspective. What we are discussing should not be good only for the City of London and only really for the center around Westminster. It has to have a sense and a positive impact for everybody. And therefore, we have to find a way to link the food systems with the question of development and inequality. There are a lot of international processes going on, very much silo-oriented, the MTGs and the post-2015 development agenda, the SDGs, the fight against hunger, eradication of poverty. They are very much silo-oriented. And in the end, the concept is more of the same, which does not really tackle inequality. And therefore, the second headline is, let's tackle the complexity, let's understand it, let's develop a theory of change, but in a step-by-step approach. There is no great plan for a transformation. This will not work. The third issue is how to do it. I'm convinced we have to bring together all these different expertise. We have to bring together civil society and private sector in a way that we are tackling these externalities to improve livelihoods of the people. Patrick mentioned I was involved in the energy change in Germany, the Energiewende. And we had one strategic entry point, the feed-in tariffs. Everybody was allowed to produce electricity from solar and from wind, and the public grid has to take it all. And there was, over 20 years, a very clear and responsible feed-in tariff. So you could make investments, the banks were our friends, people producing solar panels, and. I have my doubts that we can simply translate it for the food system. This would mean everybody can produce sustainable food, and the supermarkets have to buy it for a very high price, and this has priority, and then only the other production comes. I doubt that this is going to work. And therefore, I would not like to try, because I know if I would have to produce the food, situation would not really improve. So therefore, we have to define a strategic entry point. And defining this strategic entry point needs, and here I'm coming back to my first headline, the expertise and the input of all of you. Not in a silo-oriented way, but in a very interactive way, that we can come from an interdisciplinary scientific approach to something which I would like to call transgovernance, governance for sustainable transformation. And this is really very new, very challenging. And maybe, Patrick, you should invite us for a second conference so that we can discuss it in depth. Thank you very much.
No. Thank you so much, Alexander. So where is Guy? Oh, here we are. So Guy, can you add to that? Can you build on that? And can you keep it tight?
I'll keep it tight. I did have slides, but I'm going to ditch the slides, so I'm just going to talk. Just a little bit of background. 5 years ago or so, I was at the European Commission. I was leading on biodiversity policy. I wanted to give a little bit of context, perhaps an example of how change is taking place within that policy area to do with internalizing externalities, which may have some bearing upon what we're trying to do with the food sector. Obviously, it's a much smaller arena in terms of the scale of resources that are spent on nature conservation, but we're moving in that kind of direction. And a little bit of history. We had in around 2000, we had the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which was quite a game changer in raising awareness of the value of what we're losing and the extent to which we're losing ecosystem services, and brought to a much wider audience, in particular policy audiences, this paradigm of natural capital and ecosystem services. This led to many governments, European Commission included, while I was there, internalizing that kind of paradigm into policy, and we see it also in the UK here. So now we have, we're moving forward into European national ecosystem assessments. We have a UK national ecosystem assessment. Before I left the Commission, I was also involved in kicking off TEEB, the study on the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity, and that has also created awareness in the way that Stern did for climate change about the values of biodiversity. And all that has created an environment within which it is much easier to think about values of biodiversity and to think about new ways to deal with that. And in particular, there's a much greater receptivity now at the policy level, looking at markets as ways to solve the problem. And this is particularly encouraged by the economic crisis and the fact that the public purse cannot pay for nature conservation in the way it has done in the past. So there's increasing looking towards market mechanisms. Now, I was involved, I'm now no longer at the Commission, I'm now an entrepreneur and a consultant in emerging environmental markets. And one of the things I've done over the last couple of years has been working with something called the UK Ecosystem Markets Task Force, helping them gather evidence to support their remit. It was a business-led task force, and the remit was to identify business opportunities within the UK, primarily, to help protect and value nature. So it was, one, delivering a business bottom line, but two, delivering outcomes for conservation. And I was involved in helping gather the evidence for that. And one of the key opportunities that was pulled out was the opportunity of biodiversity offsetting. Now, this is a mechanism which internalizes the externalities. We calculated that there was potentially a $500 million market per year in the UK alone, in England alone. So that is the damage we're doing to nature every year that we're currently not internalizing, but that offsetting as a mechanism can internalize. I'm involved with a company called the Environment Bank that does just that, and essentially you've got developers impacting on nature, causing a residual impact that has not been dealt with properly under the current planning system, and you use a metric, you calculate that damage, you use the same metric on the supply side to supply uplift of nature, and there's a transfer of resources between, if you like, the polluter, the developer, and the supply side. In this case, in the UK, largely farmers who will be the beneficiaries of that. So potentially you've got a $500 million per year income to farmers to set alongside agri-environment measures. And that will be financing work in perpetuity for production of nature, which could go alongside production of food, extensive farming systems. So that's just one example of how change has been brought about to internalize externalities. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think guys shared some interesting sort of examples of where we can hybrid regulation in the market and have different mechanisms for having one element support another. So thank you. So Helen Dunn from DEFRA, I do invite you if you'd like to build on what's been said, and if that might mean that you might, thank you.
And I'm happy not to use my slides to make it a bit quicker. Yes, I think it's very much building on what Guy was talking about, because what I was going to share with you were, I suppose, some of the sort of practical work that we've been doing in DEFRA over the last few years on looking at payments for ecosystem services, and in particular some of the sort of pilots we've been trying to run and learn by doing. So I mean, I think the importance of these mechanisms is very close link, strong underpinning to valuation, understanding the wide range of ecosystem services and the values, particularly those that lie outside of the market, and trying to bring those in. So the sort of core is around providing economic incentives to land managers to take those into account, and so in a farming context, I think sort of lead to more sustainable farming outcomes. We've got publicly funded PES, we've got our big agri-environment schemes, but increasingly we're looking at a sort of wider range of funding. So in the UK, very much looking at, for example, water companies, investing in upstream catchment management, and the opportunities both for the land manager but also for the water company as a cost-effective business solution. I think it's important to recognise it's sort of work in progress, so we're very much, I suppose, at the beginning of that journey of understanding the role of natural infrastructure, or green infrastructure. But we have got a growing number of examples worldwide, and also in the UK, with things like Upstream Thinking and SCAMP and the Woodland Carbon Code. In DEFRA, we published an action plan in May this year, and that was all around developing the potential for PES and looking at where some of the key areas of opportunity we would like to work with over the next few years. So, for example, in the water context, we've got a big new investment cycle coming up. So looking at scaling up water company investment in upstream management. But also in the agri-environment context, looking to explore in the context of the new Rural Development Programme for England and agri-environment scheme, can we explore sort of new ways we can deliver, so things like auction approaches which might help to deliver better value for money, but also how we can combine different sources of funding. On our pilots, which I mentioned earlier, we've got 11 projects running at the moment, and they're across a sort of variety of contexts. That's one of the things we wanted to try and test it out, both in the rural context, but also in the urban context, covering water, flood, urban green space. In the water context, we've got quite a few projects, and I think it shows the diversity of application. It's not all one size fits all. So, for example, we've got those relating to drinking water, but also ones relating to the application in wastewater. Ian mentioned earlier the reverse auction, so it's trying out different mechanisms. The other perhaps application to highlight is we recently launched a peatland code with the IUCN in September this year, which is relating to business investment, so paying for land management, for peatland restoration, for water quality, carbon and biodiversity. And I suppose the important thing with that is that what underpinned it was a sort of good framework and also sort of robust science, so the science on peat and carbon. I think that's an important point. So just sort of finishing up on some final points. I mean, I think what we're finding is undertaking pilots is really helpful for learning to do in practice, and it sort of uncovers a whole range of issues and challenges, but that's what you need to move forward. And I think we are looking for the opportunities to scale this up more, but definitely the sort of further investment engagement is needed over the long term to really do that. And the last thing perhaps to sort of say is, you know, very much it's seen as a mechanism that will complement rather than replace the whole wide range of other approaches. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Helen, Guy, and Alexander. And what I want to do now is, because I sensed there was really some positive response to the last point that Alexander made, which is a sort of forward-looking proposal based on a variant of the Germany energy plan, I want you to stand up and say it in a sentence again, whilst Ken is preparing to ask a question about the scale of what we need. So could you just remind me and everyone else what you said right at the end about how we might take this initiative forward?
Let's do it in the opposite way. You remind me what I have said, and I will agree or disagree. Your understanding is also important of it.
Well, okay, well, we were referring to your leadership, and it was your personal leadership with the German energy plan, and you said that it wasn't possible to replicate that with food. It just wasn't that simple, and we couldn't all grow food and have the government tell the supermarkets they've got to buy it off us. What you did say is that you thought that there should be some sort of integrated, forward-looking initiative, which could be the focus of a future meeting, at which we would take, in relation to the theory of change, we'd take an integrated approach and bring all the strands that we're discussing this morning together. But I want you to put more flesh on that.
To identify the strategic entry point.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. This was perfect, I have to say. You really did listen.
You're a flatterer.
The question is how to set up a process to set in motion governance for sustainable transformation or transformation towards sustainability. And in the energy sector, after long years of discussion, we had this strategic entry point, feed-in tariffs. I personally doubt that in the food system we have a similar strategic entry point. Maybe we have different strategic entry points, but we have to discuss it. And therefore, my proposal was to organize a process where we try to find out what, from the different expertise we have here, we could contribute to define this transformation process towards sustainability. And I think this will be much more complex, it will be much more challenging, but it is worthwhile doing it. And therefore, my proposal was governance for transformation towards sustainability, a strategic orientation. And you should invite us. Don't forget it.
Does everyone agree that's quite a powerful proposition? I think we'll take that forward. Ken, would you like to discuss with us the question of scale?
Okay. Just as the question of time frame, I think I'm mic'd, right? Just as with the question of time frame, the scale question is not trivial. What will be the scale of this? Are we trying to do an entire global assessment, undifferentiated? Or, you know, assuming that we're not quite ready for that, how on earth would we do this in a way that addresses the reality of the global complexity of this, as Alexander also pointed out? So it seemed to me we have a number of options. One option would be to identify those jurisdictions globally for which we have already a very significant body of data, perhaps already modeled or easily modelable, perhaps using a common methodology or close to a common methodology. So obviously the UK, as has been already discussed, we don't have anywhere else quite like that. But you know, we perhaps you know, California or some other part of the United States might have a similar body of data with a similar set of complex conclusions, spatially differentiated conclusions that could be drawn from it. Looking across the world, perhaps Mexico is a country which has a very sophisticated, through Conabio, long-term effort to generate this kind of data. Perhaps not enough, or particularly in agriculture, but certainly in relation to natural capital, there are few countries in the world with that level of quality. And maybe there are other examples too. So you could say, well, we will take a number of different jurisdictional countries and look at those. A third approach would be a kind of a mosaic approach, which would be that we would look globally. We wouldn't try to be comprehensive, but we try to pick out a number of themes or sectors or methods and use those to illustrate a variety of points. We similarly could be asking the question about, well, would we try to take those studies and put them through some common methodological framework, which we could perhaps develop and deepen together? Or we could actually say, well, we're going to say, let's look at the richness of different approaches and actually allow these different case studies, perhaps even case studies of a similar sector, but some involving different ways of looking at health alongside natural capital or different ways of valuation, and see what that enables us to do. So I'm just, this isn't a highly considered point of view, but it seems to be stimulating various people wanting to feed back on it. So I do think we need to think about that, because otherwise I think we're not going to have an actionable and implementable approach.
Thank you. So do we agree that what needs to happen, whichever form it takes, as you've described the options, it does need to be an initiative which is global in its vision, and because even if it's drawing on regional examples or mosaicing, it's still looking at the whole picture?
I think it has to be, because, as Alexander pointed out, otherwise we're going just as if we tried to average out one single country or look at only part of high peatland areas for forest. We get the wrong answer if we don't understand that there are these dynamics across the globe. But also I think we need to capture global imagination in some way with this, and if we make it single jurisdictional, we're not going to do that.
Okay. But I've just stolen 5 minutes of your coffee break, but there is an absolute wall ahead of us, so we've really got to keep our interventions tight now. Christine, yes?
Can I get a mic?
Yes, you do. Here. All right.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Christine Chemnitz from Heinrich Böll Foundation, Germany. So I liked your last intervention very much, to really asking for a mosaic, different case studies, because I think one thing Alexander said as well, like overcoming this silo thinking. This is really one of the major obstacles we have to face, because I think every effort we do, which is now not combining like an environmental perspective with a social justice perspective, is just not leading us into the right direction. And I can understand very easily, or I can at least imagine to put a price on ecosystem services and so on. So I do understand that, but still I have my doubts in what price do we put on, for example, being a person forced off its land, or a person being starving. So I definitely think we need a variety of methodologies, and as well pointing out that, like the true cost has a limit, and therefore we as well apply different perspectives and methodologies.
Thank you very much for that. Can you please keep your points really tight now? So 1, 2, 3, and then take it from there. So yes.
Lawrence Couldrick from West Country Rivers Trust. As a practitioner that goes out and works with thousands of farmers across the West Country, I think that I support exactly the proposals that you're looking at and the need for research, but there's a sort of a desperate plea to look at the delivery organisations, the people that are out there, so that you not only can see what's happening, but also it can co-inform the research and the policy, so it can be brought back down again. It's a two-way process. Not just a case study about, look what's happening on the ground. I'm desperate to see the tools that are coming out, because I want to use them, and we already use elements. And if we're involved in the development of those tools, we can see whether they're appropriate.
Thank you. Caroline, just your point, if you would, because otherwise we're going to run out of time.
Yeah.
Just quickly, 2 points. One on the wellbeing one. Of course, the New Zealand Government Treasury is trying to introduce a wellbeing framework, and I know the UK one done, to try and reduce the importance of GDP, and I think we all need to support them because it's really hard to get that taken up by the politicians. My other one was, it's absolutely fabulous what's going on about measuring externalities and really making sure we've got good information and science, but a parallel process is still at plea for making a value proposition for this to be taken up. And I really hit the two Tim's points, and obviously that's the thing we look in New Zealand, is about the value chain, making sure we've got an empowered value chain, and that the real true costs are coming up and down that, not just for our farmers in developed countries, but developing countries as well.
Thank you. Sandy, Sam, Bruce.
Sandy Endelman, Conservation International. Just following up on Alexander's point, I really support this idea of, you know, a strategic intervention to really look at what are the change points. But I also want to emphasize 2/3 of the world's arable land that's not currently in cultivation is in Africa. And it means that in the future, Africa is going to be a huge part of the solution. And I look around this room and I don't see many Africans. And I think that, yes, it needs to be global and it needs to be scalable, but we also need to reach out to a broader group of participants than just those who are in the room now. And I think if you ask the people who are in the room now, we all know of colleagues who could really contribute substantively.
Sandy, could you give the microphone to Sam Dryden? Oh, well, we will.
Hi, Sam Dryden with the Gates Foundation. Sandy, thank you for setting this up. But so last week, Kofi Annan has convened a group of about 36 Africans to talk about what an African food system should look like in the future. And some of us participated in that meeting. And the way they came away from it was to say that there's a new narrative, and that the principles of the new narrative are global, or at least continental-wide, but that the application's more local. And so they're going to build on that, and Strive My Sawaya may be able to join us and tell a little bit about that.
Thank you very much indeed, Sam. Now, who was next? Bruce.
Bruce Hirsch, Heller Foundation. Just 3 quick points. One about policy mechanisms and regulation. There is some good data about what kind of regulation spurs innovation in business. And it's worth looking at. For example, there's quite a lot of data in California about Proposition 65, a health disclosure initiative that shows that it changed business practices significantly over a number of years. Second point about the issue of more data, more research. The data and the research by themselves don't give us an entry point. Perhaps the theory of change gives us an entry point. But what I'm thinking of is good enough data, sort of following Winnicott's notion of what a good enough mother is. You don't have to be the ideal mother to be a good mother. You have to be good enough, and there are criteria for being a good enough mother. And I think there are places where there are good enough data that we could use to move issues forward. One might be the costs of public agencies to monitor environmental and public health issues created by negative externalities. And one other, which I think is really essential to the current industrial system, especially in developed countries, would be the costs of public agencies, taxpayers' costs, to deal with the issue and the really negative effects of cheap nitrogen in the system.
Thank you. I'm going to call it to a close here, just because we must have a bit of time for coffee. Here is my attempt at a summary, which Ken might wish to add to. In order to have a supportive regulatory framework which enables the change we want to see, we have to have a change plan, and it needs to be a good enough change plan. And I'm not sure we've yet reached the consensus about what the good enough change plan is, because there are all the interventions this morning have made the point that the regulator, there are pilots going on, there's regulation doing this and doing that, but I think at the moment it's a little bit sort of anarchic because it's more suited to the existing system, which we know we've got to change. So somehow the regulatory support framework needs to be designed in conjunction with the plan, which Alexander touched on at the beginning. And so I think this is a process in time, and I don't think there's anybody here who would disagree that the market on its own cannot work without some support from the regulatory framework. But we need to make sure what kind of markets we need based on the data and the combination of the data and the big plan, and then we can design the regulatory frameworks accordingly. And there's expertise in profusion in this room to help us do that. So I'm going to leave it at that. Ken, you can just have the last word. You want to say anything?
Let's get coffee.
Okay, let's get coffee. Let's come back here, please, by 10:30. I know that's short. 1 minute. Sorry, before you go.
Just a couple of very brief announcements. Please, can you make sure if you haven't got your admittance card for Clarence House that you get it during this coffee break, because Erica will be leaving before us. So please go downstairs to the reception desk and get your admittance card. You won't get in without it.